Graça Machel stands as one of the most extraordinary women in modern history, the only woman to have served as First Lady of two different nations, Mozambique and South Africa. Through her marriages to Samora Machel, Mozambique's first president, and Nelson Mandela, South Africa's first black president, she symbolized unity, resilience, and grace across borders. But beyond her historic marriages, Graça's life story is one of deep compassion, courage, and service, a woman who dedicated her life to education, equality, and the welfare of children throughout Africa. Graça Machel, who would one day become known to the world as Graça Machel, was born on October 17, 1945, in the quiet rural village of Incadine, located in the Gaza province of Mozambique. At the time, Mozambique was still under harsh Portuguese colonial rule, a period when Africans had few rights, limited access to education, and were often subjected to forced labor and social inequality. Her birth came with both light and shadow. 3 weeks before she entered the world, her father, Tito Simbine, a poor farmer but a man of strong principles, died suddenly. He had been a deeply respected figure in the community, known for his wisdom and fairness. Graça never saw him, yet his absence marked her deeply. She grew up hearing stories about the father she never met, and those stories became her earliest lessons in perseverance, dignity, and the quiet strength of the ordinary African man. Her mother, Joanna Rosa de Luz, became her pillar of hope. A widow with several children, Joanna worked tirelessly on their small farm, cultivating maize and cassava under the hot Mozambican sun. She sold small harvests at the local market, walked long distances to fetch water, and did all this while raising her family alone. Despite her limited education, Joanna valued learning above all else. She often told young Graça, "My daughter, they can take your land, but not your mind." Those words stayed with her for life. Growing up in colonial Mozambique was not easy for an African child, and even harder for a girl. Most schools were reserved for Portuguese settlers or the children of mixed race. African children, if they were educated at all, attended mission schools run by the church. It was in one of these small, humble mission schools that Graça first learned to read and write. The classrooms were simple, often just wooden benches under a thatched roof, but for Graça, they were sacred spaces of hope. She was known among her teachers for her sharp intellect and gentle discipline. She loved books and often borrowed old, tattered ones from the missionaries just to read at night by candlelight. Her curiosity had no limit. She wanted to know why her people were poor, why they could not speak freely, and why children like her were made to feel inferior in their own homeland. By the time she was a teenager, Graça's academic brilliance caught the attention of her teachers. She earned a scholarship to study at a mission school in Lemina, South Africa, one of the few institutions that accepted black students under apartheid rule. The journey from Mozambique to South Africa was long and frightening. She was leaving everything she knew behind. But she was driven by her mother's faith in her and the burning desire to change her future. At Lemina, Graça encountered a new world. The apartheid system in South Africa was even more brutal than the colonial oppression she knew at home. Black students lived under strict rules, could not speak their native languages freely, and were constantly reminded of their supposed inferiority. Yet, instead of breaking her spirit, this environment strengthened her resolve. She began to read about African nationalism, the Pan-African movement, and the struggles for independence happening across the continent. She was inspired by the words of Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, and Amilcar Cabral, leaders who spoke of a free Africa, united by dignity and self-determination. Those ideas shaped her young mind and gave her purpose. Even in her youth, Graça was known for her composure and quiet authority. She was not loud or rebellious, but when she spoke, people listened. Her teachers saw in her the calm strength of a future leader, someone who could carry both compassion and conviction in equal measure. When she returned home from South Africa, she carried with her not only knowledge but a deep understanding that education was a weapon against oppression. The young girl from Gaza had transformed into a woman ready to stand for her people. Those early years, filled with hardship, loss, and learning, shaped the heart of the woman she would become, a symbol of African womanhood, intelligence, and grace. From the dusty paths of her childhood village to the classrooms that opened her mind, every experience laid a brick on the road that would one day lead her to the world stage, not as the wife of great men, but as a great woman in her own right. After completing her secondary education in South Africa, Graça Machel returned to Mozambique with a sharpened mind and a restless spirit. She had seen firsthand the cruelty of apartheid, and the experience had deepened her understanding of oppression. Back in her homeland, She found Mozambique still trapped under Portuguese colonial control, where freedom was a forbidden word and education for Africans was still a privilege of the few. Her outstanding academic performance earned her a scholarship to study at the University of Lisbon in Portugal, a rare opportunity for a young African woman in those days. Leaving Mozambique for Europe was both exciting and terrifying. She was entering the heart of the colonial empire that ruled her people, determined to learn from it, understand it, and one day, help dismantle it. In Lisbon, Graça studied German language and literature, and for the first time, she experienced life in a European city. The contrast between her humble upbringing and the modern world of Europe was staggering. Yet, even there, she felt the sting of racial prejudice and the silent distance that colonialism created between Africans and their colonizers. But Graça was not one to be silenced. She immersed herself in her studies while quietly engaging with other African students who shared her dreams of liberation. Lisbon in the early 1960s was a place of both repression and awakening. Across the city, African students from Angola, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique gathered in secret to discuss independence movements that were rising across the continent. They formed small intellectual circles, spaces filled with whispered debates about justice, nationalism, and the right to self-determination. It was within these student circles that Graça's political consciousness began to bloom. She met other young Mozambicans who would later become leaders of the Frelimo, Frente de Libertação de Moçambique, movement, the liberation front that would fight for Mozambique's independence. Among them were future revolutionaries like Samora Machel, who would one day become her husband. Though she was thousands of kilometers away from home, Graça was already part of the winds of change sweeping across Africa. Her studies gave her intellectual grounding, but her heart belonged to the struggle for her people's freedom. When the Portuguese secret police began to tighten control over African students suspected of anti-colonial activities, Graça was forced to act carefully. Many of her friends were arrested or deported, and some disappeared without a trace. She knew she could no longer remain in Portugal indefinitely. Her purpose was calling her home. In 1973, Graça returned to Tanzania, where Frelimo had established its headquarters after being banned in Mozambique. The movement was leading an armed struggle against Portuguese rule, and Tanzania under President Julius Nyerere was serving as a safe haven for freedom fighters from across southern Africa. There, Graça offered her skills as a teacher and translator. Her fluency in several languages and her disciplined intellect quickly made her an asset to the movement. She taught at Frelimo's school in Bagamoyo, where she educated refugee children, young Mozambicans who had fled their homeland because of the war. Her lessons went far beyond reading and writing. She taught them about their identity, their history, and their right to freedom. For Graça, education became an act of resistance. Every lesson she gave, every child she taught, was a small victory against the colonial powers that sought to keep her people ignorant. Her dedication did not go unnoticed. She soon rose through Frelimo's educational ranks and became part of the cultural and political network that supported the liberation movement. Her passion, intelligence, and humility earned her respect among soldiers and civilians alike. By the time Mozambique's War of Independence intensified in the early 1970s, Graça had transformed from a quiet village girl into a revolutionary educator, one who believed that true liberation could only be achieved when minds were freed from fear and ignorance. Those years of study and activism shaped her destiny, preparing her for a future where her voice, compassion, and leadership would carry the weight of a nation. By the early 1970s, Graça Machel had fully dedicated her life to the Mozambican liberation struggle. She was teaching in Frelimo schools in Tanzania, helping raise and educate children who had fled colonial violence, when fate brought her into contact with a man whose vision and charisma would forever change her life, Samora Machel. Samora was already a legendary figure within the movement, a former nurse turned revolutionary commander, known for his fiery speeches, tactical brilliance, and deep commitment to justice. He believed that independence would mean nothing if it did not uplift ordinary people, especially women and children. That belief drew him to Graça, whose own mission in education mirrored his ideals. Their connection began not in luxury or leisure, but in the heat of struggle. They met during Frelimo meetings and field visits to refugee camps, where both worked tirelessly to rebuild hope among the displaced. Graça was known for her calm intelligence and quiet authority, while Samora carried an infectious energy that inspired those around him. Their conversations were filled with discussions about Mozambique's future, about schools, hospitals, equality, and the new kind of society they both dreamed of. Out of these shared ideals, a bond of mutual respect and admiration grew into love. Despite the harsh conditions of wartime life, their affection blossomed, a rare softness amid the chaos of revolution. They married in 1975, the same year that Mozambique finally gained its independence after 10 long years of armed struggle. When the country raised its flag for the first time on June 25, 1975, Samora Machel became the first president of the Republic of Mozambique, and Graça Machel became the nation's first lady. Yet, she did not view the title as a privilege. She saw it as a responsibility. As First Lady, Graça refused to be a mere symbol beside her husband. She took on the enormous task of rebuilding the nation's education system, which had been devastated by war and colonial neglect. Under her leadership as Minister of Education and Culture, Mozambique launched one of the most ambitious literacy campaigns in Africa's history. She worked to ensure that every Mozambican child, regardless of gender or background, could attend school. In just a few years, the number of children in school increased dramatically, and literacy rates began to rise. She championed the education of girls, arguing that a nation cannot develop if its daughters are left behind. Graça's ministry also promoted the arts and culture as tools for national unity. She encouraged local music, traditional storytelling, and cultural festivals that celebrated Mozambique's diverse ethnic roots. She believed that independence was not only political, it was spiritual, intellectual, and cultural. Those years were filled with both triumph and hardship. Mozambique faced severe economic struggles, natural disasters, and a brutal civil war fueled by foreign powers trying to destabilize the new government. Through it all, Graça remained a pillar of grace and resilience beside her husband. She visited schools and hospitals across the country, often traveling to rural areas where few government officials went. People admired her humility. She sat with villagers, listened to their stories, and worked to understand their needs. Her relationship with Samora was one of partnership, not hierarchy. They were equals, bound by shared ideals and a shared dream of a free, self-reliant Africa. Together, they symbolized what revolutionary love could look like, a union rooted in service to others. But in 1986, tragedy struck. On October 19, President Samora Machel's plane crashed in the Lubombo Mountains, near the border of Mozambique and South Africa. The crash killed him and many members of his delegation. The cause was never fully resolved, but many believed it was a political assassination orchestrated by apartheid forces. The news shattered Mozambique and broke Graça's heart. She had lost her partner, her comrade, her friend, the man with whom she had built both a family and a nation. Yet even in grief, she refused to be consumed by despair. Graça continued to serve her country, holding on to Samora's vision of unity and progress. She turned her sorrow into strength, dedicating herself to humanitarian work, children's education, and peace-building across Africa. Her years with Samora Machel were a period of transformation, service, and sacrifice. Together, they wrote one of the most inspiring love stories in African history. Not a tale of luxury or comfort, but of purpose, faith, and devotion to the people they served. When Samora Machel died in the tragic plane crash of October 1986, Graça Machel's world fell into quiet darkness. The man she had loved, fought beside, and built a nation with was gone. Mozambique mourned as one, but for Graça, the grief was both public and deeply personal. For months, she kept out of the spotlight, retreating from political life and focusing on her children and reflection. Yet even in the depths of her sorrow, she refused to allow tragedy to silence her purpose. Slowly, Graça began to re-emerge, not as a political figure, but as a humanitarian. She realized that the best way to honor Samora's memory was to continue serving the people he had fought for. And so, she began to rebuild her life around compassion, justice, and the defense of the most vulnerable, women and children. By the late 1980s, Mozambique was still struggling with civil war and poverty. Schools were destroyed, children were orphaned, and many young people had been drawn into armed conflict. Graça traveled across war-torn regions, visiting camps and villages, comforting mothers and helping rebuild education programs. Her background as a teacher made her especially sensitive to the suffering of children. She saw them not as victims, but as potential, as the builders of a better future. Her dedication soon drew international attention. In 1990, she was appointed by the United Nations to lead a landmark study on the impact of armed conflict on children, under the direction of UN Secretary-General Boutros Boutros-Ghali. The assignment would change her life, and the world's understanding of war's effects on the youngest. For nearly 2 years, Graça traveled to war zones in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, listening to children who had been soldiers, refugees, and survivors of unimaginable trauma. She visited orphanages in Rwanda after the genocide, refugee camps in Sudan, and post-war villages in Mozambique and Liberia. Everywhere she went, she carried not only a researcher's curiosity but a mother's empathy. She sat on the ground with children, spoke softly with them, and promised that their stories would be heard. In 1996, she presented her groundbreaking report to the United Nations, Impact of Armed Conflict on Children. The findings were shocking and deeply moving. For the first time, the world saw detailed evidence of how war destroys childhoods, tears apart families, and leaves scars that last a lifetime. The report called for stronger international laws to protect children in conflict zones and for the reintegration of child soldiers through education and community healing. The world listened. The Machel Report, as it became known, changed global policy. It inspired the creation of new UN offices dedicated to protecting children in armed conflict and strengthened advocacy for children's rights around the world. But Graça did not stop there. She went on to found and support several organizations focused on education, women's empowerment, and child welfare, including the Foundation for Community Development, FDC, in Mozambique and later the Graça Machel Trust, which operates across Africa. These organizations have empowered thousands of women to become entrepreneurs, leaders, and advocates in their communities. She also worked closely with UNICEF, UNESCO, and numerous global charities, using her voice to call for equality, education, and healthcare access for all children, especially girls. Her belief was simple but profound: investing in women and children is investing in the future of humanity. Over time, Graça Machel became one of the most respected moral leaders in the world, not because of titles or fame, but because of her unwavering humanity. She spoke softly, but her words carried weight. Presidents, activists, and citizens alike admired her calm wisdom and her refusal to be corrupted by power or pride. In every speech and project, she carried the memory of Mozambique's struggles, the lessons of her childhood, and the spirit of Samora Machel's dream for freedom. Her mission had expanded, no longer limited by borders or politics. She was now working for all of Africa's children, for those whose voices the world too easily ignored. Graça Machel had transformed her pain into purpose, her loss into leadership. And in doing so, she became not just the widow of a president, but a mother of nations, a symbol of healing, education, and hope for generations to come. By the early 1990s, Graça Machel had already become a respected humanitarian, admired across Africa and beyond. She had endured deep loss and carried her work with quiet dignity. Far away in South Africa, another giant of history, Nelson Mandela, was emerging from the shadows of 27 years in prison. Both had walked different paths through suffering, yet shared the same dream: a free, just, and peaceful Africa. Their paths first crossed in 1994, shortly after Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. At the time, Graça was still mourning her husband, Samora Machel, who had died 8 years earlier. Mandela himself was recently divorced from Winnie Mandela, and though he was surrounded by power and history, he often confessed to feeling lonely. When the two finally met, it was not at a grand political event, but through mutual friends who admired their shared humility and compassion. Mandela had long respected Graça's work with the United Nations and her dedication to children's rights. He saw in her not just a beautiful woman, but a spirit of strength and kindness that matched his own. At first, Graça was cautious. She was deeply private and hesitant to step back into the public spotlight. Mandela, however, was patient and gentle. He began to write her letters, simple, warm notes that revealed the tender heart behind his iconic leadership. He admired her intelligence, her independence, and her refusal to be defined by the men she had married. Their friendship slowly blossomed into affection. Mandela once said to her, "You make me want to live again." It was a love rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than youthful infatuation. Graça found in him a man who understood loss, sacrifice, and the quiet loneliness of leadership. In 1998, on July 18th, Nelson Mandela's 80th birthday, the two were married in a private ceremony attended by family and close friends. It was a celebration not of political power, but of human connection. For the second time in her life, Graça became a First Lady, now of South Africa, the only woman in history to serve as First Lady of 2 different countries. As South Africa's First Lady, Graça chose to maintain her humble and humanitarian approach. She did not seek glamour or grand displays of status. Instead, she focused on issues close to her heart: education, women's empowerment, and the welfare of children affected by poverty and HIV/AIDS. She continued her work with the Graça Machel Trust and global organizations, using her platform to shine a light on social justice. She accompanied Mandela on official visits and global missions, always by his side, offering quiet strength and grace. Those who met them often said their love was visible, expressed in small gestures, shared laughter, and the gentle way they looked at each other. Together, they embodied a love story that transcended age, race, and borders, a love born out of shared suffering and deep understanding. Even after Mandela retired from the presidency, Graça remained his closest companion and caregiver. As his health declined in his later years, she stood faithfully by him, not as the wife of a world icon, but as a woman devoted to the man behind the legend. She shielded his dignity, protected his privacy, and ensured that he spent his final years surrounded by peace and love. When Nelson Mandela passed away on December 5, 2013, Graça mourned with quiet strength, just as she had done decades earlier with Samora. But this time, she carried not just sorrow, but also pride, for she had shared her life with two of Africa's greatest sons, and had loved them both with honesty, courage, and grace. Her years with Mandela revealed a side of her humanity that history rarely sees in great leaders: the tenderness, patience, and emotional resilience that come from surviving heartbreak and still believing in love. Together, they showed the world that true power lies not in dominance, but in compassion. Graça once said, "Love is not about possession, it is about partnership, about lifting each other higher." That was the essence of her union with Nelson Mandela, a partnership that brought healing not only to them but to the nations they represented. Their love became a living symbol of what Africa could be, united by shared history, strengthened by forgiveness, and illuminated by hope. As the decades passed, Graça Machel emerged not only as a witness to history but as one of its quiet architects, a woman whose life has bridged nations, generations, and causes. She has been called many names: the symbol of African womanhood, the conscience of leadership, the mother of nations. Yet, beyond every title, Graça Machel remains a teacher at heart, one who believes that the truest measure of greatness lies in the lives one touches. After Nelson Mandela's passing in 2013, Graça could have stepped away from public life, but her spirit refused to rest. She continued her humanitarian mission with even greater purpose, turning her pain into renewed passion for justice. Through the Graça Machel Trust, she championed women's leadership, children's rights, and economic empowerment across Africa. Her organization has supported thousands of African women in business, health, and education, helping them become changemakers in their own communities. She has also played a key role in the Elders, the Global Council of Moral Leaders founded by Nelson Mandela, which includes figures like Kofi Annan, Desmond Tutu, and Mary Robinson. Within this group, Graça became known for her voice of calm wisdom, a moral compass who advocates for peace, gender equality, and the protection of children in conflict zones. Whenever she speaks, she does so with quiet conviction, reminding world leaders that compassion and justice must guide every decision. Her advocacy has reached every corner of the globe. She has addressed the United Nations, the African Union, and countless international forums, calling for accountability in governance, an end to violence against women, and investment in education. Her words carry the authority of experience, for she has lived the struggles she speaks about. Graça Machel's influence also extends into the realm of thought and inspiration. She has written and spoken widely about African identity, women's power, and post-colonial transformation, urging young Africans to dream boldly and act with integrity. Her mentorship of youth, especially young women, has created a generation of leaders who see service as strength. Even in her later years, Graça remains tireless. She continues to travel, teach, and advise global institutions. In every gathering, her presence commands respect, not through loudness, but through the quiet dignity of one who has lived truthfully. Her life stands as a bridge between eras, from colonial oppression to independence, from war to peace, from personal loss to global purpose. She has known both the warmth of love and the coldness of grief, yet she has turned each experience into wisdom that uplifts others. Graça Machel's story is not just the tale of one woman, it is the story of Africa's strength, endurance, and evolution. She has proven that power can exist alongside kindness, that leadership can coexist with humility, and that true greatness comes from service, not status. Today, she continues to inspire millions, not because she was the wife of two presidents, but because she chose to be the mother of humanity's conscience. Her name has become synonymous with compassion, her legacy woven into the very fabric of Africa's rebirth. When asked once what keeps her going after so many decades of struggle, Graça simply said, "I am never tired when I am serving others. My joy is to see people rise." And indeed, through her work, countless people have risen. Children who found education, women who found their voice, and nations that found hope. Graça Machel's journey, from a small village in Mozambique to the halls of the United Nations, remains one of the most extraordinary human stories of our time. It is a story of courage, intellect, and boundless love, a story that reminds the world that even in the face of sorrow, grace can still change history.